This week's World Expanding History resource is the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture. This independent research organization is located in Williamsburg, Virginia, and sponsored by William and Mary, the college in Williamsburg. Its mission is to expand our understanding of just how vast early America was, how irregular and multifaceted its existence was, how many viewpoints there still are to see, and how many stories there still are to be told. The wide range of topics they cover could inspire any number of alternate histories and alternate futures about America. The 17th and 18th centuries were full of possibilities. The shape of the country could have been many things. The Omohundro Institute hosts conferences, less formal chats on topics in development, lecture series, author events. It even helped develop the podcast Ben Franklin's World, which has piles of fascinating episodes on early America. The Institute was started in 1943 and has been working to expand the understanding of just what early America was, who was there, and what has happened ever since. You can check out their website at oieahc.wm.edu, and I'll put a link in the notes. You can check out lectures if you're in their area, or you can see what publications they have on a variety of topics. Episode 90, 18th Century Housekeeping. Everybody outside. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at what sort of outdoor jobs went into food preparation and allowed the 18th century colonial food system to operate. From the growing and harvesting to moving stuff around the countryside and around the world. This is also the period when a clear link between food and money was established for regular people, and the seeds of a global economy planted in the 15th century spice trade entered a new stage of growth. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that for most people, in most parts of the world, for most of human history, people did not purchase food with money. Most people were not compensated for their labor with money. And the people that worked the land, if they did not own the land, they did not pay rents with money. Metal specie or coins as a value holder for thousands of years has mainly been a plaything of the wealthy. Regular people have only used coins of agreed upon value as a means of exchange for a couple of hundred years. Yes, there were exceptions. People as biologicals are just always going to have exceptions. But for the most part, unless you were of the wealthy class or a soldier of some sort, all transactions of value were done with some version of barter, the exchange of goods and labor. This is what made it so tough to save up for one's old age. Labor can't really be banked, and most goods are perishable or consumable. This is much of the reason why the multi-generational home was the norm. People didn't go anywhere when they got old. There was nowhere for people to go, nor was there a reason for them to do so. Most people started as part of a family and simply remained part of one. We went into orphans pretty deep last week, but even they were often absorbed into a family structure of some sort. Family was the original pay-it-forward construction, with a little payback on the end, sure. I mean, there were problems with that model, but in most places it was the only one in place for an awfully long time. The idea of inside and outside becomes interesting in the 18th century British North American colonies. For most of the 17th century, inside was for storage and for sleeping. Buildings were mostly temporary and small. They largely lacked light, windows, and comfort. Inside, for most people, was dark, cramped, and stuffy. One lived nearly all one's life outdoors. Inside was a safe place to sleep, maybe a place to cook out of the wind and rain, and to store food away from vermin. By the 18th century, more substantial buildings had been constructed. Most were an imitation of European buildings, and the materials were largely wood, fieldstone, and brick, which includes adobe construction. Fieldstone, by the way, simply means rocks picked up out of the field or off the ground and used more or less as is. So when you see a wall or a fireplace or the Newport Tower in Rhode Island, or the Grove Park Inn in Asheville, North Carolina, and links to pictures of these are in the show notes, where stones of all shapes and sizes have been mortared together, that's Fieldstone. Stone quarrying was picking up, so larger, more imposing buildings made out of cut-to-fit stone were in the process of construction, but those other building methods were what was happening. For fun, you can scroll through a list of the oldest buildings in the U.S. on Wikipedia. I've put a link in here for that too, and you can see for yourself that wood, brick, and fieldstone are around for a good long time before quarried stone. Before entire buildings were constructed of quarried stone, it was commonly used for structural corners, foundations, and door lintels, that thing across the top of the door. But entirely stone buildings were vanishingly rare until the 19th century. The White House and the Capitol building being some of the earliest buildings made of mostly quarried stone in the former colonies. Oh, and another fun fact, when you look at McMansions in the US, they have these funny lumpy decorations on their corners. What they're doing is they're trying to imply with those foam stick-ons that they are using quarried stone when they're just actually wood-based building materials slathered over with stucco. This is a quick shout out to McMansion Hell, and I have a link to a house Kate reviews that has this feature. Anyway, because buildings and houses were larger in the 18th century than they were in the 17th, there simply was more indoors for people to be in. So the idea of separate indoor work and outdoor work started to really develop. Last week, of course, I spoke of indoor and household work, which acknowledges that a fair bit of the domestic work of the 18th century was still taking place outdoors and in outbuildings. Not all household work was exactly inside, but it was still very closely tied to the indoors. But we're here this week to talk more about the non-domestic work, the work more associated with production, processing, and transport that had to happen to make 18th century food possible. And this all happened outside and away from the house. So it's time to look at what that all was. While women and children worked at household tasks that nearly all rotated around the kitchen or the cooking fire, it was mostly men and older children who did outdoor tasks. A large number of these outdoor tasks did have a strength element to them. But time and time again, when men have been unavailable to take them on, it has been shown that combinations of teamwork, cooperation, cleverness, and technology make these jobs possible for just about any adult. What made the outdoor non-domestic tasks men's work is that women typically had childcare and cooking duties. They had to be close to the cook fire where food and soap and laundry happened. They needed somewhere for infants and small children to sleep safely and to be fed adequately. Men's work was not so much men's work as it was work for people who didn't have childcare, cooking, or sanitary responsibilities. And so the fair number of women who didn't have those responsibilities for large parts of their lives or ever also participated regularly in outdoor non-household work. And yet this sort of work did come to be known in shorthand as men's work. Over time, reasons why men were doing it have been elided, glossed over, and scrambled. Because everyone who does this work gets strong, indoors or out. But somehow only the strength of the men was noted. Just as women stress that it's less practical for doing physical work will become fashionable, so too will a weakness that implies women are incapable of this non-domestic labor. The heart of 18th century food is very close to what it was in the 17th century: beer and cider, bread and stew. With the advent of more indoor kitchens, more metal, and more imports, yes, there was certainly more to food, but the central pillars of food were much the same as they were back in England. The main grains had shifted from rye, barley, and wheat to corn and, in some places, rice. But that hadn't changed the focus of what proper food was or how generally a complete meal was structured. Much of the outdoor labor went into raising, harvesting, and processing grains. Grain reigned supreme in the 18th century foodosphere in the colonies. In order to produce beer and bread and porridges and mushes, not to mention the rice for pilaus and other dishes, many a field had to be prepared. The 18th century saw a changeover from the harrow to the plow. In the 17th century, the prevailing harrow technology and a general shortage of draft animals meant that the horse or ox-drawn plow was a rarity. It existed, but it wasn't common. Instead, fields were harrowed. The top layer of soil was scratched and disturbed with a harrow, which is a crosshatch arrangement of sticks that holds spikes. The harrow went hand in hand with the broadcast seeding style for planting grains. However, as the colonies grew into material exporters they had been envisioned as, the homestyle, generally inefficient practice of tossing wheat, rye, or oat grains onto crisscross scraped ground faded away. It had been the way things were done because it was cheap and lower effort. Not low effort, just lower. But as horses arrived and oxen grew up and more iron was around, the ironclad plowshare became the way of the farmer. Growing corn was in transition as well. The local tribes had used small hillocks for growing corn plants. This was sometimes done in a companion planting manner with the beans and squash and sunflowers that were also regularly cultivated crops. As colonial fields grew larger and plow technology spread, the hillock planting by colonists receded to be replaced by row planting. Hillock planting, or using little mounds to hold each plant, would continue for tobacco plants. And this was, of course, part of what made tobacco farming so labor-consuming and why it was one of the largest consumers of the enslaved in Virginia and the Carolinas. Wheat, rye, and barley were mostly grown north of Virginia, and corn grew everywhere. I talked about the staggering numbers of varieties of corn that existed in North America at the time of colonization and its phenomenal adaptability way back in episodes 6 and 7. But in South Carolina and northern Georgia, rice was queen. Early on, rice was grown in dryland fashion similar to wheat. By the 18th century, wet rice was becoming common. For that, not only was regular field preparation required, a fair amount of hydrological engineering was needed as well. Canals, locks, gates, and dams were required along with the plowing and overturning of the thick tidal area mud that was used to grow rice. In the next century, this will literally be a monumental effort. So there's field preparation and planting, then there's some tending, but the next big work comes with harvesting and processing grain for storage. Hand harvesting and stacking was the way of all grains in the 18th century. Whether it was cutting wheat, barley, rye, oats, or rice stalks, the tool was either a hand sickle or a long scythe, and this depended on what was being harvested and what tools were available. While the field preparation was in flux between hillocks and harrows and plows, the scythe technology in use for cutting the grain and associated hay was more or less what had been used all the way back into the Bronze Age. Sure, the metallurgy had changed over thousands of years, but the long snaith or pole with the grasping handle continued in use for mowing much as it had back in ancient Egypt and in other grain-growing cultures, moving out from the old Fertile Crescent 10,000 years ago. Gathering up the different sorts of grain, drying it, and then removing it from the stalks for storage had to happen in a pretty short period of time because it would determine much of the food supply for the following year. Thus, even indoor workers would be required to help. The household would join the outside workers and usually provide them with food as usual. Transporting excess grain for sale was outdoor work, and that started to be more of a job in the 18th century. North of Virginia, this was largely an overland wagon road job. So caring for vehicles and draft animals, mainly oxen in this age, was part of the food system. For places along the Hudson River in New York, or along the larger rivers of New Jersey and Pennsylvania, or most places of any note, Virginia and South, moved their grain crops by boat. So rowers, sailors, and bargemen were also essential in the movement of food. Some of the harvested grain, once stored, would become entirely the work of the domestic sphere. But other grains, wheat, rye, and barley usually, would have a variety of other fates. They would be ground for flour, so a miller and the millstone dresser also had a hand in the food system. But these grains, along with corn, also found their way into beer and more ardent spirits. So malting houses could also be the next stop for these grains. In the 18th century, running a malting floor, the place where grains would sprout and convert their starches to sugar so they could be snatched up for fermentation, was done by both men and women. Malting had largely been women's work in pre-colonial European contexts. But as beer went from a household to a village to a money-making task, as the volumes of malt made went up, and possibly more importantly, the fact that malting grain became a money-making occupation, it was taken from women's hands. Or, at least women were relegated to work roles, while men would own a business because they could sign contracts and become business owners. So, by the 18th century, malting and more brewing, except in the most rustic of circumstances, became an outdoor, non-domestic job. Distilling beers into whiskeys, it required metal tools, in the colonial context anyway, and so also became an almost exclusively male job, because in order to purchase the still materials and sell the produce, money and contracts were involved. A quick side note. On the domestic side, small kitchen stills for making perfumes and flavorings and medicines remained in women's hands, but typically they were only used by high-status women who had the time to do such things and lived in houses large enough to accommodate an indoor pantry. Once milled, the fate of flour was to return to the domestic sphere. There was very little bake shop baking in the 18th century and only in the largest cities. For the most part, baking remained a household job. For the meat that was eaten in the 18th century diet, herding was the job associated with it. Domestic fowl would mostly be the duty of household workers, but large herds or flocks or gaggles would be typically run by older children. The day-to-day tending of groups of animals would be a pretty boring job. Children would watch over sheep or cows or turkeys or geese and even pigs. Moving them around a grazing area or in and out of shelters between day and night would keep the animals safer and easier to handle than leaving them to go entirely wild all on their own. The wild longhorn steers of Texas will be an example of the problems with this. There were some islands free of wolves and wildcats that would be used for holding sheep or sometimes cows or pigs, and they would only be visited at slaughter time. But even if there were islands that could hold bird flocks, they wouldn't have been used anyway. Flocks always have to be watched. They were always at risk of attack from eagles and hawks, and even though chickens and turkeys are fairly flightless and geese can be made to think they can't fly away, if they aren't watched over and brought home to roost each night, they tend to get adventurous. So animal herding was definitely one of those older children jobs, once they were sent out of the house and the domestic sphere. Adults, mostly men, would take a hand when it was time to drive a herd to a population center for sale or slaughter. For that was heavy and often dangerous work. Driving a herd of pigs or cows or even turkeys to market requires different skills than just keeping them together in their home range. Ah, yes, and the exchange of money was involved. Netting or shooting, with arrow or gun, non-domestic birds was also outdoor work. But the processing of those little birds into food was entirely domestic work. On occasion, the hunter might remove innards, but any housewife worth her salt knew how to take out the digestive tract, the circulatory system, the reproductive organs, in order to leave the bird as just meat and feathers. The good, useful parts. Okay, the heart, livers, and even gizzards could be tasty too. Larger farm animals, they could be driven to a slaughterhouse to be turned into salt meat for sale in the Caribbean or for use by the Navy, but many of them were simply turned into meat on their farm in their season. Small animals, like extra piglets or excess lambs and goat kids, were often turned into spring meals entirely in the kitchen. It was only fully grown animals, for the purpose of stocking the winter larder or getting a few more calories out of a work animal past its prime, that was typically taken on by men, because women in their kitchens were regularly butchering all manner of meat and fowl. The anatomy of the animals was no mystery to them. Rather, it was a size problem. A piglet might be processed in a wash tub to contain the mess, but a full-grown hog or steer, it needed to be dealt with out in the yard with the whole crew. Salting, smoking, potting, and drying meat, That all happened, you guessed it, back near the kitchen fire. Fishing, whether by net, spear, or line, was definitely outdoor work. The fish ponds and mill ponds that were built in Europe had never been developed in the colonies. The combination of naturally available streams and lake fish and labor shortages meant that engineering such projects were seen as unnecessary. Once the freshwater and shore fish were caught and hopefully cleaned, they again became the responsibility of the domestic world. But there was also a fishing industry out at sea. Those cod that had teased the riches of this mystery western land to Europe as far back as the 11th century, when Ericsson and his crew found the coasts of Newfoundland and Labrador. By the 18th century, boats out of Boston Harbor and other Atlantic colonies fished the sea for cod that were gutted, salted, and wind-dried along the coast. Those jobs, along with the barreling and shipping, employed all sorts of outdoor labor. North American dried cod by the 18th century was consistently of lower quality than the cod processed in Europe, so American cod mainly was used to feed enslaved workers in the Caribbean. So even though the American cod catch largely left the colonies, it returned as sugar and molasses and rum. The outdoor workers in the cod fishing industry, unlike the stream and shore fishers, had several removes between them and their effects on the food system. But without them, an important element of the 18th century colonial food economy, sugar, would not have been able to grow to the extent that it did. Sugar was quite possibly the single most massive category of outdoor work after all the grains. It feels a little odd to be talking work on sugar plantations when I'm talking about the 18th century North American colonies. But the Caribbean sugar islands and what we think of as the 13 colonies were deeply entangled with each other at this point. One did not exist without the other. The continental colonies were founded in part with hopes of expanding the Caribbean sugar dynasty. The sugar dollars were extremely important to the British economy, and the sugar industry as it existed in the 18th century could not have survived without the food inputs of cod, salt pork, salt beef, and corn from the mainland. The islands were so dedicated to sugar production at this point, in both land and labor, that there would be large-scale starvation at times the imports were cut off. While all outdoor work was done by both men and women, men were in the clear majority on the mainland because all of the other household responsibilities fell to women. But in sugar, outdoor work was done by men and women equally, because the structure of the sugar islands gave enslaved workers almost no opportunity to have any sort of domestic existence at all. In the 18th century, between grain and sugar, plants were important to the food system, but there was very little trade in what we consider normal fruits and vegetables. They were involved in the outdoor work sphere in only limited ways. Dried peas and beans were bought and sold. Their work cycle worked very much the way grain did. Planting a field of beans or peas for a future as food for sailors and soldiers was an outdoor job. Harvest and processing usually involved everyone, and barrels of dried peas traveled alongside grain. Any fresh fruit and vegetables lived entirely at home. While there were a few large orchards that were managed as part of outdoor work, most fruit trees, along with other fruit and vegetable sources, lay within the work of the domestic sphere. On large plantations of the southern colonies, large orchard operations used to make cider and apple brandy for sale would be the work of the enslaved, but for most people, a domestic orchard was plenty of bounty, and no special dedication to work outside the domestic sphere was necessary. Barrel makers had been important from the start, and the wagon and wheelwrights were becoming more so. While we have the image in our minds of a man in his shirt sleeves shaping barrel staves, it turns out they were not the only ones in the barrel trade. Back in episode 67, I spoke of the existence of both slack and tight barrels. The slack barrels, the non-watertight ones, those were made by all sorts of people. They required far less strength and skill, and they could be made from more sorts of wood. The tight barrels made for transporting liquid, especially good beers that kept through the winter or longer, along with Madeira wines and those mysteriously superior Caribbean rums, those are the fancy barrels that required the most skill, the longest apprenticeships, the nicest wood, and yes, the most strength. So yes, those stereotypical barrel makers were about and were essential to the transport and storage of food and drink, but there were also plenty of women and children, especially when it came to the manufacture of slack barrels that were used in most contexts. Iron workers were also a category of outdoor work that was required in the 18th century colonial food system. They built tools for cooking, of course, the pots and cauldrons and spiders and gridirons and oven doors and knives and so on. But iron was also a requirement in the outdoor work that supported the food system. The scythes and other mowing tools for grain, as well as shovels, hoes, mattocks, billhooks, plows, and other field tools used in farming. Many of the connector pieces in the mills that ground grain, in wagons and barges and boats that supported the commodity food trade were also iron. The guns that shot birds and game, the cannon of the Navy that purchased the salt meat and dried peas, the iron hoops of the barrels that were shipped, the saw blades that cut the logs, and the axes that felled the trees. Iron had been important at the starting of the colonies, but over the 18th century, it was being incorporated into the early mechanization, manufacture, processing, and transport of colonial products. The 19th century will be full of wild and startling changes, but that explosive growth is being incubated in the iron furnaces of the 18th century. So ironwork, as much as farming, was a sort of outdoor work that was vitally important to the growth and functioning of the 18th century food system. But underlying it all, the one set of outdoor work I think held up all the other pieces of the food system. In fact, the whole colonial enterprise was wood. Without the lumber industry, the colonies were a bust. The colonial harvest of white pine mast timbers and oak planks allowed the British to rapidly increase their navy. Soon, British shipbuilding of commercial vessels came to the colonial shore. There was the ability to build cheap and sturdy housing for the population flooding the shores and build all sorts of barrels to ship products hither and yon. Timber and the lumberjacks that cut it, along with more skilled woodworkers that built things, were all essential outdoor workers in the colonial food system. But the main thing that the easy-to-reach wood did for the colonial food scene was to fuel it all. There was a bit of a fuel crisis in 17th and 18th century England. Those stories of renegade charcoal burners were a sign of that. But in the colonies, there appeared to be inexhaustible wood. So much wood that it could be wasted in inefficient but fast plank and board manufacture. Thousands of trees that should have been set aside for the crown were used up by colonists, and still the Royal Navy didn't seem to go wanting. Enormous charcoal piles were burned that would be used for the manufacture of iron, both in the colonies and back in England. There was never a worry about cooking fuel. The all-day stew pot lived on. Big, wide open hearths that let heat leak out all over in every direction, doing nothing in particular, were built in modest homes and grand ones alike because no one had any worry about a shortage of wood. So these are the major categories of outdoor labor that were connected to the 18th century North American colonial food system. Grain, meat, transport, fishing, sugar, iron, and wood all produced jobs people did. And more of those jobs were done away from a self-contained village. People were working specialized jobs, lumberjack or cod processor, away from any sort of extended family system that in the past had provided them with the rest of their needs. The single men and orphans and enslaved captives that were shipped over to colonial shores to do the work of laying the foundations of America lacked the traditional support systems of societies that used to function mostly locally. And so in this way, all those people became a part of the emerging global economic system. Everybody living in the midst of it wasn't sure what to make of it, except that they definitely realized that some sort of money made things easier. And making money available to more than just the ruling and merchant classes is going to become a hallmark of the emerging country. Because sugar and coffee and tea and ground grain, not to mention lemons and pineapples, are all things you can't grow yourself, yet they become important parts of the food system, money will become important too. The household jobs didn't particularly interact with the outside world, so they will not get tangled up in the money question. But the outdoor jobs, the ones that are done away from the safety and supplies and food of home, do rapidly become entangled with money. This doesn't lead to the immediate devaluing of domestic work in the colonies, but it does put something in motion. Indoor work has the appearance of being self-feeding and self-sustaining. Outdoor work, especially for commodity things, stuff produced in bulk, it starts to have an obvious price you can put on it. Next week, we've hit the end of the season, and it's just about time to go to war, or at least to read up on it and report on its effects on the food system. Before I do that, there will be a wrap-up show, a look back at where we've been this season, and a chance to cover anything you wish I hadn't gone by so fast. I'll be back for next week's show to wrap up things for Season 2 before I dive into the research and see what Season 3 is going to look like. Thanks for listening. So, it's time. It is time to send in those questions. And a reminder, are they using forks yet? Is a reasonable and viable question. Details that I barely mentioned or something that I skipped over entirely that you want to hear more about are great topics. Those questions and any other during the regular season will reach me through email at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. Twitter and Instagram also get to me in reasonable amounts of time. Reviews, stars, and especially words are lovely, and I thank all of you who have reviewed me so far. During this upcoming research break, I'll get those show notes updated. It'll be sources, pictures, and some sarcasm. Also, intelligent speech is happening again this year, but more details as that develops. Last year, I spoke on gumbo. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle. The link to the show notes and other ways to send me questions are also in the show's Twitter, Insta, and post.news bios at THOA Food and in the show description.